Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
He took my car without asking. Again. He wrecked it. Again. And when I asked him what the hell he was thinking, he looked me straight in the eye, like he was doing me a favor by even acknowledging the question, and said with that smug, juvenile grin he's perfected since we were kids, "Chill out, Mel. It's just a car." And then he laughed. That little dry, sarcastic, condescending laugh like this was all just one more oops moment I'd inevitably clean up for him. That laugh was what finally broke me. Not the dented fender, not the cracked windshield, not the fact that he'd borrowed my car behind my back while his was in the shop again, because he never takes care of anything. It was that laugh. Because in that 1 second, I knew nothing had changed, and nothing ever would, unless I made damn sure it did. You ever hit that moment where you suddenly see your whole family dynamic like you're standing outside of it for the first time? Like you've been stuck in a bad play your whole life, reading the same lines they gave you, and finally one day you go off script and realize, this isn't my role anymore. I'm done playing the fixer. That's what hit me in that garage, standing in front of my scuffed-up Honda Civic, the car I paid for, maintained, insured, and babed like it was my lifeline, while Josh shrugged and checked his phone like he was the victim of some cosmic inconvenience. He didn't even ask if I was okay with him taking it. Didn't apologize. Didn't offer to pay for the damages. And the worst part? He expected me to react exactly like I always had, with a sigh, maybe a few sharp words, followed by a passive, "It's fine, I'll handle it." I didn't yell. I didn't slam the door. I didn't tell him to go to hell, even though that's exactly where I wanted to send him. Instead, I did something that scared him way more. I smiled. A calm, tight-lipped smile that told him absolutely nothing. Then I nodded slowly, said, "Okay," like I was agreeing to something only I knew the rules to, and walked back into the house like I had a casserole in the oven instead of a Category 5 hurricane building behind my ribcage. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because most people in my situation would either blow up in the moment or stew about it until their resentment turned into ulcers or passive-aggressive family Facebook posts. But not me. I've had years, no, decades, to practice biting my tongue, to perfect the art of internal combustion. What people like Josh don't understand is that quiet people aren't weak. We're just patient. And when we finally move, it's with purpose. So I poured myself a coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and called my insurance company. I didn't yell. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I just told them the truth. That someone took my car without permission. That they crashed it. That it wasn't me behind the wheel, and I had no idea he'd even taken it until he brought it back looking like it had gone through a demolition derby. The agent on the other end, a woman named Linda with a voice like she'd seen 1,000 domestic car disasters, asked me if I knew the person. I said yes. "Family?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "My brother." Then she asked the million-dollar question, would I like to name him as the responsible party for the claim? And that's when I exhaled, like I'd been holding my breath since childhood. "Yes," I said. I would. I don't think I even blinked the rest of the call. I gave his full name, license number, address. I handed over everything on a silver platter. I could already hear his voice in my head, calling me dramatic, overreacting, vindictive. But I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing this out of survival. Because if I didn't set a boundary now, I'd never get another chance. He'd just keep doing what he's always done, screwing up and counting on me to mop up the mess. For those of you watching and thinking, it's just a car, isn't this a bit much? I get it. But ask yourself this. How many times have you let someone in your life cross a line because you were told that family comes first? How many times have you swallowed your own anger just to keep the peace, only to find that you were the only one sacrificing anything at all? At what point do you stop letting it slide? I wasn't trying to ruin his life. But I wasn't going to ruin mine to protect his anymore. 3 hours later, I got a follow-up email from the insurance company confirming the claim. Josh would be listed as the at-fault driver. Since he wasn't listed on my policy and the car wasn't borrowed with permission, he'd be held personally liable. And because he'd already racked up points on his license from a DUI 2 years ago, something we all politely ignored at the time, this accident would likely trigger a suspension. I didn't feel good. I didn't feel bad either. I felt still. Like for the first time in a long time, I'd done something that aligned with the version of myself I kept suppressing. By the time Josh realized what I'd done, it was too late. He called me 2 days later, screaming into the phone like a teenager who got grounded. "You named me to your insurance? Are you insane?" he shouted. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I didn't respond. I just let him go on, ranting about how he might lose his license, how it wasn't even that bad of an accident, how I'd embarrassed him. At one point he actually said, "You know how this makes me look?" And that's when it hit me, he didn't care about what he did. He cared about how it made him look. So I said one sentence before hanging up. "Actions have consequences, Josh. Welcome to adulthood." And I meant every word. When people say, "It's just a car," they usually mean it as a way to brush things off, a phrase meant to downplay material things, to push past the damage and get on with life. But what they never seem to understand, especially people like my brother Josh, is that it's never really about the thing itself, not when you've spent your whole life being the one who's expected to stay calm, to forgive, to absorb every bruise and crack without ever showing that it hurts. That car wasn't just a hunk of metal on 4 tires, it was the physical proof of every choice I had to make when everyone else in my life was still allowed to screw around without thinking twice. It was my escape, my proof of responsibility, the one thing that was entirely mine in a world where I was constantly expected to give and give without ever being asked if I had anything left to spare. I remember when I bought it, used, yes, but clean, solid, reliable, with money I'd saved over 3 years, working 2 jobs and skipping vacations and ignoring the way my own needs always came last. I didn't take out a loan. I didn't ask for help. I didn't even tell my parents about it until the paperwork was signed and the keys were in my hand, because I knew what they'd say. They'd ask why I was spending so much. They'd offer to let me borrow one of theirs, just like they always did, just like they offered Josh things he never earned. And I didn't want that. I wanted something that was mine, untouched, unpaid for by anyone else's guilt or generosity. I wanted independence, and in a family like ours, that was a quiet kind of rebellion. Growing up with Josh was like living in the eye of a hurricane that everyone else insisted was just a breeze. He was the golden child with the charming smile, the kid who always got a second, third, fourth chance, who laughed off mistakes like they were just funny stories in the making. When he got caught smoking in the school bathroom, Mom said boys will be boys. When he totaled Dad's old truck in high school, they said he was just learning. When he dropped out of college the first time, and then the second time, the narrative somehow shifted to how hard it was for him to find his passion, how people like him just needed time to bloom. Meanwhile, I was expected to keep my grades up, hold down a job, take care of things at home when they were busy, and always keep the peace. By the time we were adults, the patterns were cemented. If Josh forgot to pay his phone bill, I'd get the "can you help your brother out" call. If he didn't show up to Thanksgiving dinner until dessert, it was, well, at least he came. If I dared show irritation, dared point out that I was the only one who showed up on time, who paid her dues, who held her tongue even when it felt like swallowing broken glass, then I was being dramatic, sensitive, rigid. Josh got to be the lovable screw-up. I was just the one who was supposed to hold everything together. So no, it wasn't just a car. It was the boundary line. And the moment he crossed it without so much as a heads up, without a shred of guilt or consideration, and then stood in my garage grinning like he'd borrowed a pencil without asking, it triggered something in me I didn't even know I'd been holding back. It brought to the surface every Thanksgiving where I stayed quiet while he made crude jokes. Every birthday I spent alone because he forgot. Every damn family photo where I stood stiff in the background while he mugged for the camera like he was the only one that mattered. After I filed the report with the insurance company, I sat in my car, well, what was left of my car, and let the quiet settle over me like a weighted blanket. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that reminds you just how long you've been carrying a load that wasn't yours. I thought about all the years I kept giving people chances because I was told that's what good daughters do, what big sisters do, what women do in families where being agreeable is somehow more important than being respected. I thought about every time Josh laughed something off while I was still trying to breathe through the mess he left behind. When the email came from the insurance company 2 days later, confirming that Josh would be financially and legally responsible for the damages, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and fear. Because yes, I wanted him to face consequences. I wanted him to understand, for once, what it meant to carry the weight of his own actions. But I also knew this wouldn't go quietly. Josh had never been held accountable for anything, not really. And I could already see the dominoes lining up, the familiar choreography of guilt-tripping, gaslighting, and family phone calls that would come pouring in the minute he realized he couldn't charm or joke his way out of this one. Still, there was a clarity that came with knowing I'd finally drawn a line in the sand. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't try to explain myself to people who'd already decided what role I was supposed to play. I simply told the truth and let the pieces fall where they may. The next morning, I got a call from my mother. "Melanie, what did you do?" The tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory, the same one she used when I was 10 years old and dared to complain that Josh got more dessert. I could already hear the script forming in her voice, the same old lines about family unity, about not airing dirty laundry, about how Josh was just going through a tough time. And in that moment, standing in my kitchen in my worn-out slippers with the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air, I knew exactly how the next few weeks would go. But I also knew something else. This time, I wasn't backing down. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a shift in power, a quiet tension that hangs in the air like static before a storm. And I felt it all around me during those first few days after the insurance claim was processed and the official paperwork started rolling out. It was like the calm between heartbeats, a brief but powerful stillness where, for the first time, I knew I wasn't the one scrambling to fix anything. And Josh was still caught up in the delusion that nothing would come of it, that somehow this would all blow over like every other disaster in his trail of carelessness, because he still believed, in that deep, entitled part of himself that had never been challenged, that I would cave, that I would clean it up, that I would explain it all away with an apologetic smile and an exhausted sigh, just like I always had. But that's the thing about people like Josh, they don't realize they're walking into a different version of the story until it's already too late. They don't notice that the script has changed until the consequences are no longer theoretical. So when the letter from the DMV arrived, and the official notice of license suspension hit his mailbox like a cold slap in the face, it didn't just shake his reality, it cracked it wide open. And the first place he ran to when it all came crashing down was me, because in his mind, there was still a chance to reverse it, to plead, to bargain, to make me feel bad enough that I'd pick up the mess out of sheer guilt. He didn't even have the decency to call first. I was at work, an actual full-time job with deadlines and responsibilities, not that he's ever truly grasped what that means. When I saw him pull into the office parking lot in a borrowed pickup truck that looked like it hadn't had an oil change since Obama's first term, my stomach dropped the second I saw him slam the door and stalk toward the entrance like a man on a mission, his shoulders tight, his mouth already forming the beginnings of whatever self-righteous speech he'd been rehearsing during the drive. I met him in the lobby before he could make it to the reception desk, because the last thing I needed was Josh putting on a show in front of my coworkers, dragging our family drama into the one space I had managed to keep clean of it. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" he hissed the moment I stepped into his line of sight, and if I'd had any doubt before that he was unraveling, it vanished the instant I saw the frantic look in his eyes, the wild, uneven breathing, the way he was shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the sheer frustration of finally being told no and realizing the word carried weight. "You actually named me? You actually went through with it? My license is gone, Mel. Gone. Do you know what that means?" I didn't respond right away. I just watched him, letting the question hang in the air, because deep down he didn't care if I understood the consequences, he only cared that they had arrived. He kept going, his voice rising in pitch, throwing words like weapons trying to wound. "I could lose my job over this. I've got deliveries next week. What the hell am I supposed to do? Why didn't you just come to me? You seriously had to go behind my back and nuke my life because of a dented fender? Jesus, Melanie, you're such a damn martyr." And there it was, the deflection, The shifting of blame, the implication that I was the problem, that I was the overreactor, the cruel sister who had crossed some invisible moral line. I could have yelled back. I could have thrown all his past mistakes in his face, pulled out the mental ledger I'd been updating since I was 13 years old. But instead, I pulled out my phone slowly, deliberately, and tapped a button that began recording. His eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me, and for the first time, I saw a flash of hesitation, a tiny crack in the facade. "You want to keep going?" I asked quietly, my voice steady, controlled. "Because I'd love to let HR hear how you speak to women at work. I bet they'd be thrilled to get that on record." He went pale. He took a step back, his mouth working soundlessly like he couldn't quite decide whether to double down or backpedal. The thing about Josh is that his bravado only works when he feels like he's got the upper hand, when he thinks everyone around him is too scared or too tired to push back. He doesn't know what to do when someone stops playing along. And that's exactly what I'd done. I'd stopped giving him the script he was used to. I wasn't the sister who'd cover for him, not anymore. I wasn't the doormat who'd absorb his rage and turn it into apologies. "I'm serious, Mel," he said finally, softer now but no less bitter, like a man forced to chew his own pride. "This is too far. You've made your point. Just call them and fix it. You can undo it. Say it was a mistake. Come on." But I didn't budge. I told him that I wasn't calling anyone, that I'd told the truth and the system had responded accordingly, and if he didn't like the outcome, maybe next time he'd think twice before taking something that didn't belong to him and laughing in the owner's face. He stood there for a moment longer, staring at me like he didn't recognize who I was, and maybe he didn't. Maybe this version of me, the one who enforced boundaries and stood her ground, was completely foreign to him. Eventually, he turned around and stormed out, slamming the lobby door so hard it rattled the glass. Later that night, the text messages started rolling in. My mother first, with a carefully worded plea disguised as maternal concern. Then my father, more abrupt, asking why I was punishing my brother so publicly. Then a string of passive-aggressive lines from our cousin Laurel, who hadn't spoken to me in months, but suddenly felt moved to weigh in on how family should resolve things internally. It was like watching the house lights come up on a stage I hadn't agreed to stand on. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had a critique, but no one had a memory of all the times I'd stayed silent to keep the peace they now claimed to care so much about. The pressure was building again. I could feel the old instinct to cave, to explain, to soften the blow, clawing at my ribs like a reflex. But I didn't respond. Not to any of them. Because I knew what came next. I knew there'd be a meeting. A sit-down. A thinly disguised intervention where they'd try to realign the family narrative and drag me back into the role I'd abandoned. But they were in for a surprise. Because this time, I was bringing receipts. The thing about being labeled the responsible one in a family like mine is that the title sounds flattering until you realize it's just a polite way of saying you're expected to carry more weight than everyone else, to absorb more damage, to forgive more often, and to accept being taken for granted as part of your unspoken job description. And once you stop fulfilling that role, even for a moment, even just once, you become the villain, the cold-hearted one, the person who has suddenly changed. As if the years of quiet endurance and reluctant patience were simply your natural state and not the product of countless choices you made to avoid turning every dinner into a war zone. That's exactly what I was dealing with now, in the days after Josh's outburst in my office, as my phone continued buzzing with thinly veiled reprimands disguised as concern, each one nudging me to be the bigger person. Each one asking me to undo the one decision I had made entirely for myself. What none of them seemed to grasp, or maybe didn't care to, is that being the bigger person isn't supposed to mean being the one who always gives up ground, who always lets things slide, who carries the burden of everyone else's irresponsibility while smiling through clenched teeth and pretending that being stepped on feels like a compliment. But in my family, that's exactly what it had come to mean, and the minute I stepped outside of that expectation, by telling the truth, by letting consequences play out instead of absorbing them, the backlash came in waves. The messages had evolved by now, shifting from panicked and emotional to passive-aggressive and strategic. My mother, ever the diplomat, had started using phrases like, "We just want to talk this through," and "maybe there's been a misunderstanding," as if she hadn't already taken a side. My father, less refined in his approach, had sent me a voicemail where he used the phrase family embarrassment 3 times in under a minute and somehow managed to make Josh's suspended license sound like it was a bigger tragedy than my years of quietly being dismissed. But the one that really got to me was from Josh himself, or rather, the version of him that only appears when he's trying to manipulate the narrative, calm, composed, and wrapped in self-pity, like a sad clown looking for applause. "Look," the message began, his voice low and theatrical. "I know I messed up, and I'm sorry, okay? I really am. But you're blowing this way out of proportion. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was just a mistake. I thought you'd understand. I thought, of all people, you would understand." That line, "you would understand," was a masterstroke of emotional blackmail, and he knew it. He knew that my entire life had been built on the foundation of understanding others, of reading the room, of making space for the flaws and failures of the people around me while suppressing my own feelings to keep things from falling apart. That's what he was counting on. He was banking on the idea that if he pushed the right guilt buttons, I'd fold, that I'd step back into the role I'd outgrown and make it all go away. But I had already learned something too important to forget. When you spend your life protecting someone from the consequences of their actions, you're not helping them, you're enabling them, and in doing so, you're abandoning yourself. So when the group text came through from my mother, "We're all getting together this Sunday to talk. Just us. No drama," I didn't reply right away. I sat with it for a few hours, made a cup of coffee, reread every message they'd sent over the past week, and gathered everything I had: the insurance report, the texts from Josh, the photos of the car, even a screenshot of the voicemail he'd left me months ago when he was too drunk to form coherent sentences and blamed me for the fact that our parents didn't buy him a new truck after his last accident. I printed it all out neatly, page by page, like I was preparing for a courtroom trial, because in a way, that's exactly what it was. When Sunday arrived, I didn't dress up. I wore jeans, a plain shirt, no makeup. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking I was performing. I walked into my parents' house with a folder under my arm and a calmness in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, not the calm of surrender, but the kind that comes from knowing you're about to stop lying to yourself. Everyone was already there, of course, because they wanted to control the tone before I arrived. My mother gave me that warm, slightly too wide smile she uses when she's nervous, and my father offered a gruff nod, like this was a business meeting he couldn't reschedule. Josh sat slouched on the couch, his arms folded, his expression oscillating between smug and sulking, clearly unsure which posture would get him the most sympathy. I didn't wait for them to start. I sat down, placed the folder on the table, and opened it. "I'm not here to argue," I said, and my voice sounded foreign even to me, firm, clear, measured. "I'm here because you wanted to understand my side. So here it is." I passed the documents around like a teacher distributing test papers. No one spoke. My mother flipped through hers with trembling fingers. My father squinted at the text like it might rearrange itself into something less damning. Josh didn't touch his. "For years," I continued, "I've kept quiet, and every time Josh screwed up, I cleaned it up or ignored it. Not because I thought it was okay, but because you all taught me that speaking up made me difficult. That being upset meant I was overreacting. That letting things go is what good sisters do. So I did it. Over and over again. Until this." I gestured toward the reports. He took something that wasn't his. He damaged it. He laughed about it. And he expected me to carry it like always. But I didn't. Because I'm done pretending this is normal. My mother opened her mouth to speak, probably to say something about how this family has been through a lot, or how we shouldn't air our dirty laundry, but I cut her off before she could start down that road. "I didn't come here for an apology. And I'm not asking for agreement. I just want you all to know that from this point forward, I'm not shielding anyone from the consequences of their choices. Not anymore. If Josh wants to rebuild his life, he can. But it won't be through me." Then I stood up, left the folder on the table, and walked out. Nobody followed me. Nobody called after me. And the silence I heard as I closed the front door behind me was louder than anything they could have said. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't peace. But it was something better, clarity. And that would be enough. There's a specific, almost surgical kind of clarity that settles into your bones after you finally say the thing you've been holding in for years, decades, even, and walk away without apology or fear. A clarity that doesn't come with fireworks or applause or even a dramatic closing of the door, but instead with a deep, almost primal quiet that resonates in your body like the final chord of a long, dissonant symphony finally resolving into something that resembles peace. That was the state I found myself in during the days that followed the so-called family meeting, which in truth had been less of a meeting and more of a soft ambush masked in civility, designed to reprogram me back into compliance, and when that failed, when I refused to re-enter the loop they'd kept me in for so long, it wasn't rage or chaos that followed, but a stunned, paralyzing silence that said more than words ever could. I didn't hear from anyone for 3 full days after that afternoon. Not my mother with her guilt-laced casseroles and therapy speak, not my father with his gruff pronouncements and veiled ultimatums, and certainly not Josh, whose ability to bounce back from even the most severe fallout had finally met a wall he couldn't climb with a grin and a half-hearted apology. And in those 3 days, I began to understand something I had never truly allowed myself to grasp until then, that the life I'd been living wasn't just burdened by dysfunction, it was shaped around it, contorted like a body living too long with a bad spine. Always compensating, always adjusting, never knowing how much pain you've been in until the ache stops and you finally get to stand straight. I went to work, drank my coffee without checking my phone obsessively, took long, aimless walks in the evening air without imagining I'd return to a dozen missed calls and emotional landmines waiting in my voicemail. I was waiting for the backlash, for the inevitable explosion, for someone to decide that the silence had gone on long enough and it was time to punish me for stepping outside the carefully drawn family lines. But what came instead was quieter, more dangerous, a single voicemail, dropped into my inbox without warning, from Josh, and the moment I saw his name on the screen, my heart did that strange, involuntary stutter, not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. Curious whether he had finally, truly seen the damage he'd done, or if this was just one more manipulation wrapped in sorrow, another performance designed to draw me back in. I played the message alone, sitting at my kitchen table in the glow of a late afternoon sun that made everything look softer than it was, as if even the light wanted to cushion what I was about to hear. His voice, when it came through the speaker, was unsteady in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers, and he'd come home drunk one night, crying over something he wouldn't explain. But now there was no bravado, no spin, just a broken rhythm of breath and words, as if even forming the apology was exhausting for him. "I don't know how to start this," he said, pausing for a long moment that crackled with silence. "I don't even know if you'll listen. But if you are, I'm sorry. For everything. Not just the car. Not just this last screw-up. For all of it. For making you feel like you had to carry everything. I see it now. I didn't before. I don't know how I didn't, but I didn't. And I get it if you don't believe me. I wanted you to know that I'm trying. That I'm finally trying." I sat there for a long time after the message ended, not moving, not crying, not reaching for the phone to play it again, because what he said, regardless of whether it was genuine or not, wasn't the point anymore. The point was that, for the first time in our lives, the weight of consequences had finally landed in his lap instead of mine. The words, however heartfelt, weren't what mattered. It was the silence that followed them, the fact that he'd finally been forced to sit with his choices, to look at the wreckage not through the lens of someone else's forgiveness, but through his own regret. Whether he meant it or not, whether he changed or not, was beside the point. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry or vengeful or holding on to some righteous indignation, but because I didn't need to. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for his pain. I didn't feel the need to guide him toward the right path or explain why I'd done what I'd done. I didn't feel compelled to cushion the impact of his own actions with my usual diplomacy and self-sacrifice. I simply let the message sit there, unplayed again, unanswered, like a letter left on the kitchen counter of a house that's already been packed up and abandoned. Later that evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, not to celebrate, not to numb anything, but simply as a small ritual, a quiet acknowledgement of a line crossed and a chapter closed, and I stood by the window looking out over the darkening street, watching the shadows stretch long and thin across the pavement like threads being pulled taut before they finally snap. There was no dramatic crescendo, no perfect ending tied with a bow, just the steady pulse of something that felt like freedom, not loud or dazzling, but real. Because the truth is, you don't always get closure from the people who hurt you. Sometimes, you get it from finally choosing not to let their damage define you anymore. Sometimes, you get it from silence, from stillness, from walking away without needing to be understood. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get it from watching someone fall not because you pushed them, but because you finally stepped out of the way and let gravity do what it does. So when people ask if I regret it, if I regret naming him, if I regret not forgiving faster, if I regret not working it out like families are supposed to, I just shake my head. Because what they don't understand is that I didn't destroy anything. I didn't light the match. I just stopped shielding him from the fire. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kindest thing I ever did for him.